Greetings, greetings family, Sista Shanice in the house. I want to thank you so much for joining me once again for the Sista Shanice show. And I'd also like to really thank everybody that viewed my last video, that shared it, that commented. Thank you all so much. I so appreciate the comments. More love, more strength, more power to each and every one of you. Well, on today's show, family, as you know, last week on the 6th of September, sadly we lost one of our iconic heroes, one of our living legends, none other than Robert Mugabe. And so today's show, I want to pay respects to the man himself. I think it's really important that we as a people take the time out to actually document, comment and, you know, celebrate our own heroes and sheroes, because we can't expect the mainstream media, the Eurocentric mainstream media, to celebrate our greats. They certainly won't do so. Remember, their agenda is going to be totally different from ours. So our revolutionary leader is going to be the thorn in their back. So Robert Mugabe, as the revolutionary leader that he was of Zimbabwe, we want to celebrate him right now. We want to talk about his great achievements, and we also want to celebrate his successes. Now, no leader could be in power for 37 years without making mistakes. And I'm sure if he was able to turn back the hands of time, there were things that he would have done differently, like all of us would have done. So I'm not suggesting that he was perfect. However, it's really important that we do celebrate the accomplishments and the outstanding achievements of our greats in the same way that other races do. What I have been seeing in the mainstream Eurocentric news is what looks to me like a hate propaganda campaign against Robert Mugabe, and they're clearly intending on tarnishing his name and calling him all sorts of, trying to label him with all sorts of awful names as well. So, you know, it's we that's got to do for we. We're the ones who are going to have to celebrate our greats. We're the ones who are going to have to rise up the names of our greats as they go on to our ancestors, and I'm going to attempt to do so today in today's Sista Shanice show. So certainly hope that you're going to join me in commending the name of Robert Mugabe. Robert Gabriel Mugabe, from humble beginnings to revolutionary freedom fighter, from revolutionary freedom fighter to prime minister, and then from prime minister to president of Zimbabwe. Wow, what a journey, what a journey. So we want to pay tribute to the memory of this legendary man. We want to celebrate his intelligence network as well, because it hasn't been easy staying on the top. He was able to avert plots to destabilize his country and plunge it into civil war. I'll come on to that in a little while. He was able to avert plots to murder him, and you know, despite almost 20 years of sanctions, he was undefiant. He was determined to be a mighty thorn in the face of his oppressors. He wasn't afraid to stand firm. He was confident as an African man. He stood for his Pan-Africanist beliefs. He was multifaceted as a human being. He had, you know, different sides to him, the good, the bad, and maybe some would say the ugly as well. But aren't we all as human beings multifaceted? None of us are perfect. So we, the children of those Pan-Africanist heroes, the beneficiaries of the works of those Pan-Africanists, we are the ones who have to elevate the names of those greats. We are the ones who have to make sure that their name is immortalized in the pages of our history. Robert Mugabe was born on the 21st of February 1924, a time when the country was colonized by the Europeans, and Africans were being treated worse than dogs. And this is what was actually told to me when I visited Zimbabwe last year. There were veterans who were recounting the way that the Europeans used to treat them. One of them said to me that they would talk to you as if they were talking to a baboon. I was told that there were water fountains. Blacks couldn't drink from the same water fountains as whites. Black people had to go up the lifts in buildings. They weren't allowed, rather, to go up in the lift in buildings. They'd have to take the stairs. I was told about a hanging tree that existed where they would hang people from. I was told about the brutality that individuals experienced. So these were dreadful times. And when you consider, as a young man growing up during those times as well, his parents' experience would have been even worse, because, you know, his parents were the survivors of the first Chemerenge, and that's a war, you know, that was waged from way back in about 1845 or so, all the way up to about the 1890s. And then we had the second Chemerenge just before the turn of the next century. And so that war, well over 50-year war, when millions of Africans were just wiped off, you know, the face of the southern region of Africa. That's why until today, when you go to Zimbabwe, it's sparsely populated compared to the vast amount of land that's there. Millions of people just wiped off the face of the earth. So there came a young man named Robert Mugabe who would have witnessed, you know, the wickedness of the apartheid system and the regime, and he clearly made up in his mind that he would rather die fighting than see his people suffer the way that they were suffering during that time. So in my opinion, what does Robert Mugabe represent? Well, his name is greater than the man himself. What he represents is greater than the name of the man himself. It's greater than his successes. It's greater than his achievements. Why? Because it's what he stood for as an African man. His name will live on alongside other great revolutionaries like Sam Sharp, Paul Bogle, Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines, Dulcie September, Malcolm X, Bogle, Bookman Dutty, so many. We've got thousands of heroes and sheroes, and Robert Mugabe will be a legend alongside those others. And may their spirits rise up, more revolutionaries during these times whose focus is on developing and improving the situation that their people find themselves in. So rising up the spirits of our ancestors, rising up the spirits of our revolutionaries who have been joined by Robert Mugabe, may they welcome him in with open arms for the works that he did here on this realm during his time. So Robert Mugabe represents the greatness that African men actually possess. Robert Mugabe represents the awakening of a people. He represents a people who are prepared to fight to the death for their land and for their country. He represented the Africans who in the days of old said, I would rather die fighting than live a life as a slave. He represents the Africans and the millions of fallen soldiers who, and innocent civilians, that over the 200 years of European invasion and control over their land, died fighting for their land, their beautiful country of Zimbabwe. He represents the African who was prepared to stand up in the face of the powerful oppressors, the powerful instruments of white colonialism. He represents the fight against colonialism and apartheid, a man who fought alongside his thousands of countrymen in the bush, and country women, I must add, in the bush. He represents survival because he survived the Chemerenge from 1964 to 79. He was loved by the majority of his population, who understood him and weren't brainwashed by the Eurocentric media propaganda campaigns. The vast majority of his population saw through that racial media campaign and supported the man for what he stood for and for the works that he was doing. He was elected to power on five separate elections and remained in power for 37 magnificent years. At the beginning of his presidency, he represented a country that had about 5,000 white farmers who owned about 80% of the land. But by the end of his presidency, the landscape had greatly changed, because when Britain decided not to honour the Lancaster Agreement, he didn't stand in the way of his people deciding to take their land back. He allowed them to take back the land because he realised that the British were not going to honour the Lancaster Agreement. So by the time he was no longer the president of the country, the ownership of land and the landscape had completely changed, and now it's probably about 80% black ownership, if not higher, thanks to the man himself and the bravery of the people of Zimbabwe. And despite the damaging and crippling effects of sanctions, because as we know, the economy of Zimbabwe prior to him taking it over was totally owned and controlled by the Europeans. And so when they were forced to leave, they took their economic wealth with them. They took the instruments of the economy with them. And for those that stayed, they continued to operate under the radar, but they weren't putting their money back into the banks. Just imagine, if a European owns a supermarket and the population spend 80% of their income in that supermarket, and that supermarket isn't putting their money into the bank but banking it with a bank abroad. They're effectively crippling the economy, and this was happening and continues to happen right across the board in Zimbabwe. Hence why there are the economic challenges coupled with about 18 years of sanctions on top. It's a miracle that the country is nevertheless continuing to thrive and do as well as it is. Now, during his time, Robert Mugabe actually made education one of his priorities, and as a result of making it his priority, Zimbabweans are among the most educated of Africans in the world. Listen to this.
Under Smith, there was one school, St. Mary's, in Chitungwiza, for a population of more than 1 million people. And the Mugabe government, in the first 3 years of being in power, had built 25 schools in that township. And the significant thing about those schools was that each school had a woodwork center, it had a metalwork center, it had a food and nutrition center, it had a fashion and fabric center, and it had geography, biology, and science labs. So those were well-equipped schools. The government managed to build those schools because they used a standard plan for each school. And so every school looked like every other school, but every school was extremely well equipped. And after building the schools, of course, there was a shortage of teachers. So the Zimbabwe government actually imported teachers from Australia, from New Zealand, from Britain, from Mauritius, from India, from Ghana, from Uganda, and everywhere. So it was actually a very interesting time to teach in Zimbabwe because you met all these people from all over the world. Harare became suddenly very cosmopolitan. And the government also increased teacher training colleges in those first three years very, very significantly in order to eventually replace the expatriate teaching fraternity with Zimbabweans. And, if you read the literature, the pre-1980 literature for Zimbabwe, the literacy rate was actually very low. And, under the Mugabe government, the literacy rate of Zimbabwe increased very dramatically to be one of the highest in Africa today.
And he went on, Robert Mugabe went on to build 4,500 schools across Zimbabwe, 13 universities, 8 polytechnics, 7 nursing schools and medical schools. That is a phenomenal record. The educational standard that he instilled is of international standards and of the highest when compared to standards around the world. He created 19,000 hospital beds in 30 years. He took the infant mortality rate from 200 out of every 1,000 births to less than 60 out of every 1,000 births. Under the Smith regime, most Africans weren't allowed to read, weren't allowed to learn, were deprived the opportunities to go to school. Look now at the educational standards of that country. Now, I know that the education that they were given actually prepared them for jobs, and that the jobs don't actually exist because it was the Europeans who controlled the corporations, the businesses, the organizations, etc. So when they left, you know, they took their businesses, their organizations, and they re-established it elsewhere. And so those who were educated for jobs, you know, weren't able to find those jobs. So many left the country and went abroad. But what needs to happen is that the brains of the country needs to come back to create jobs, to create and set up new businesses, set up, you know, organizational institutions and corporations, and maximize the wealth that's in the land, you know, so that you can create jobs for your people. And I'm sure that that was the hope of Robert Mugabe when he was putting in place the education system for the people. It was in the hope that the next generation will be able to take his vision forward for an independent, glorious Zimbabwe. And that is still, I'm sure, going to be his hope in the spirit realm. Going forward in terms of education for Africa, I would strongly recommend an African-centered education system. What would that look like? Well, it'd be an education system that glorifies everything African, glorifies African heroes and sheroes, glorifies African scientists, African civilization, African architecture, African art, African culture, African diversity, and African education African-centered education would then instill greatness and pride in all of those Africans that go through the schooling and the university system. And they will be less likely to want to flee and go to Europe because they're proud of an African and will be determined, you know, to resurrect those great empires, those great kingdoms that Africans once had prior to the invasions of the Europeans. So going forward, the education system needs to change. It also needs to be localized so that those who are attending school are aware of the wealth under their feet and how to extract that wealth, how to process it, how to refine it, how to turn it into finished goods, how to export it to the rest of the world, so that the education system needs to be updated so that it's relevant for the locality. It can't continue to prepare people for jobs which are now abroad, for jobs which are in Europe, for jobs which are in America, for jobs which are in China. It needs to prepare people to be able to maximize, you know, the wealth, the mineral wealth, the agricultural wealth that exists within the country. Now, some of you might remember the attempted coup of Equatorial Guinea that was averted by, that was intercepted by Robert Mugabe. Listen to this, family, and check out these newspaper clips as well.
Mugabe wondered why such young people needed such powerful ammunition to go hunt in Equatorial Guinea. In doing his research further, he found out that this was a coup in the making. He allowed them to land in Zimbabwe. They loaded their plane, and just before takeoff, they were all arrested. The ringleader of that group was none other than the son of the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher. She had to fly to Zimbabwe and paid handsomely to get her son out. The last one of those prisoners left Zimbabwe about 6-7 years ago. Had these young people succeeded, it would have been another coup. There you go, the Africans again. Such, my brothers and sisters, is the story of your Africa. They don't do coups anymore. They simply create instability. So when you hear of an instability in an African country, ask yourself, what is really going on?
Yes, family, these were perilous times. And to make it worse, imagine Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister, who should have been setting an example, actually gave her son her approval. Another very interesting and revealing piece of information that's now available in the public domain is the fact that, you know, Tony Blair, when he became Prime Minister, was asking the South African Prime Minister of the day to help him to invade Zimbabwe so that he could topple Mugabe. So, you know, obviously Mbeki didn't go ahead with that request. But here we have yet another incident of Europe during peaceful times planning and scheming behind closed doors to try and topple Robert Mugabe. But his intelligence and his security at the time obviously was able to circumvent that from actually happening. So Robert Mugabe's journey was unprecedented. There were so many African liberation freedom fighters who didn't manage to live out the days to try and transform their country. Can you imagine where Zimbabwe would be now economically if it wasn't for the external interference of the IMF and the World Banks and the likes, if it wasn't for the external plots and schemes to try and sabotage their economy, if the money that was being turned over in their country was going through their own banks? Can you imagine where that country would be now? Well, clearly there's a lot of work still left to be done. I want to rise up Zimbabwe and the Zimbabweans. You have an absolutely beautiful country. I've had the privilege of visiting that country on a number of occasions. I'll show you some images of the country in maybe another video, and I'll also share with you an opportunity that I had with the group that travelled with me to Zimbabwe, the opportunity that we had to have dinner with the First Lady, none other than Grace Mugabe, who was the First Lady at the time. I'll be sharing that story and many more stories actually about Zimbabwe, because I've organised 2 trips to Zimbabwe so far, and I've got another trip happening next month. And whilst out there, we learnt so much about the country, and if you're interested, I'll be happy to share some of those stories with you. So family, we want to, elevate the name of Robert Mugabe. We want to enshrine his name in songs. So we're calling on the musicians to sing their songs about Mugabe, calling on the artists to paint, him in his wonderful, glorious, different images. We want to elevate him. The authors write about him. Let's make sure that our story is the story that our future generations will read about Robert Mugabe, and not the trash that they're putting about him in the newspapers. So family, thanks for watching the video. I hope you found it interesting and that you'll share it. I welcome your comments and your feedback, and if you're interested in some of those stories that we learnt in Zimbabwe, like for example Chipongo and Heroes Acre, some of their heroes and sheroes, our dinner with Grace Mugabe, our trip from Harare to Masvinga to Bulawayo to Hwange, which is where we did the safari, to Musuya Tunyo, the smoke that thunders that they called Victoria Falls. You know, if you want us to share some of those images and video clips with you, happy to do so as well. So rising up, the entire family out there. Sister Shanice out of here for now. One love, family.